In the Arizona Territory of 1878, hope dies fast. The sun doesn't just shine, it attacks. It bakes the ground into a cracked gray plate, and it bleaches the bones of anything that couldn't outrun its fate. This is a story about a woman who had nothing left to lose in the enemy she was supposed to kill. Her name was Sarah McGregor, and her ranch, Dust Devil Creek, was a tombstone for a life that was already over. 6 months ago, her husband Angus was alive. His laugh was a thunder that shook the rafters of their small cabin. The clang of his hammer was the ranch's heartbeat. Now there was just silence. A silence so heavy it felt like being buried alive. Angus wasn't taken by a bullet or an arrow. There was no glory in his end. A bull, a rope, a moment of bad luck. And just like that, he was gone. He left her with 100 acres of dirt, 20 scrawny cows, and a mountain of debt. A debt held by a man named Bartholomew Corian. Corian was more than a man. He was an empire builder. His Sea-Bar Ranch was a kingdom that bordered Sarah's pathetic patch of land on two sides. His fences were new, his cattle were fat, and his smile was as sharp as a razor. He wanted her land. More specifically, he wanted her water, the seasonal creek that was the key to owning the whole valley. While Angus was alive, he'd been a wall of stubborn pride against Corian's polite, predatory offers. Now there was just Sarah, and she felt about as strong as a rotten fence post. She was ready to give up, to let the bank and Corian swallow her whole. And then, one blistering afternoon, fate sent her an answer. It was lying in the dirt, half dead. A broken man with a shattered leg. An Apache warrior. Her choice was simple. Let the enemy of her people die and surrender to her fate, or save him, and declare war on the entire world. The heat was a physical thing, a weight pressing down, blurring the air into a shimmering haze. Sarah was chasing a calf, a stupid panic thing that had found a break in the fence. The very fence that separated her dying ranch from Corian's thriving one. The calf led her a mile down a dry creek bed, a graveyard of sun-bleached stones and thorny mesquite. Her lungs burned, and a curse was caught in her dry throat. She finally cornered the animal in a small box canyon, the rock walls trapping it. As she raised her rope, her eyes caught something wrong. A patch of color against the pale rock, tucked under an overhang. A dark reddish-brown stain, a stain the sun hadn't been able to erase. It looked like blood. Her hand went to the pistol tucked in her waistband. A gun Angus had made her learn to use, but that always felt cold and alien against her skin. She tied the calf and moved forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The smell hit her first. Copper and rot. The unmistakable scent of a wound gone bad. And there he was, lying in a sliver of shade. An Apache man. He was unconscious, his face a mask of dried blood and dirt. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper you could barely hear. His cotton shirt was in shreds, but it was his leg that made her gasp. It was a ruin. The bone of his lower leg was shattered, jutting out from the skin at a sickening, unnatural angle. The flesh around it was swollen and purple, angry and infected. He was terrifying. He was the devil from the stories told in hushed tones around the fire. The savage renegade, the enemy. But looking at him, broken and dying in the dust, she didn't see a demon. She saw a man. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? The law in Prescott would call this a victory, one less hostile to worry about. Corian's men, especially his sneering foreman, Silas Kane, would have put a bullet in him without a second thought, maybe collected a bounty. Leaving him was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to walk away, to forget she'd ever seen him. He wasn't her problem. She had her own life to save. But then she looked at his face. She saw the lines of pain carved around his mouth. She saw the shared humanity of a body broken by this unforgiving land. Her husband had died here. Her dreams had died here. Was she really going to stand by and watch another life get snuffed out in this godforsaken dust? Something inside her snapped. A cold, sharp wave of defiance cut through her fear. This land had taken everything. Corian was trying to take the rest. The world had dealt her an impossible hand. And in that moment, staring at the dying Apache, She decided she was done playing by its rules. With a grunt that came from the bottom of her soul, she holstered her pistol, leaned down, and began the impossible task of saving the life of her enemy. Getting him back to the ranch was a nightmare. He was wiry but dense with a warrior's muscle, a dead weight that fought her every step of the way. She used her rope, her own aching body, and the terrified calf as a clumsy counterweight, half pulling, half carrying him across the brutal landscape. By the time she reached the small, musty barn, dusk was painting the sky in shades of blood and bruised purple. She was soaked in sweat, every muscle screaming, her body trembling with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in her bones. She laid him on a bed of clean straw in an empty stall, the scent of hay and dust mixed with the foul stench of his wound. By the flickering light of a single lantern, the injury looked even worse. It was a compound fracture, the bones splintered and exposed to the filth. It was a miracle he was still alive. It would be a bigger miracle if he saw the sunrise. Her first thought was Doc Abernathy in Prescott, but that was an 8-hour round trip. She couldn't leave him. And more than that, bringing the doctor here would be like nailing a signed confession to the sheriff's door. Widow McGregor is harboring a wounded Apache. It was a death sentence for him and the end of everything for her. She was on her own. She remembered her mother's lessons, bits and pieces of folk medicine. She set to work, her mind a numb buzz of desperate focus. She boiled water over her small stove. She sterilized a skinning knife in the lantern's flame until the steel glowed. She tore strips from one of Angus's old shirts, the fabric soft against her calloused hands. The next few hours were a waking hell. She forced a trickle of water and whiskey between his cracked, feverish lips. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open for a terrifying second. They were black pits of agony, a pain so profound it stole her breath. Then the fever took him again. Cleaning the wound was the worst part. He thrashed in his delirium, guttural sounds tearing from his throat, a language of pure suffering. Sarah, gritting her teeth until her jaw ached, held him down with the weight of her entire body while she worked with the other hand, her stomach churning, the metallic taste of bile rising in her throat. She didn't know how to set the bone. It was an impossible, gruesome puzzle. All she could do was pick out the dirt and grit, her fingers clumsy, her movements frantic. She made a poultice of crushed yarrow she found near the creek, an old remedy to stop bleeding. She bound the mangled leg tightly between two pieces of a split fence post. It was a crude, desperate act, and she knew it probably wasn't enough. For 3 days he was a ghost, drifting on the edge of death. Sarah barely slept, a zombie moving between her ranch chores and the dim, suffocating heat of the barn. She forced broth and water down his throat. She changed the bloody dressings. She sat with him through the long, silent nights, the only sound his fevered muttering and the frantic beating of her own heart. In those quiet hours, she studied him. Beneath the grime, his face was sharp and intelligent. High cheekbones, a proud jaw. His body was a roadmap of old scars, a story of a life lived on the edge of a knife. He wasn't the monster from the stories. He was a man. On the fourth morning, she walked into the barn, and her heart stopped. He was awake. The fever was gone. He was propped up on one elbow, his black eyes clear and sharp, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, predatory intensity. There was no gratitude in that gaze, only a cold, weary assessment. He was a cornered wolf sizing up the trapper who held his life in her hands. Sarah held up her hands, a gesture of peace, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Water?" she asked, her voice a hoarse crackle. He said nothing. His gaze flickered from her face to his splinted leg, then back again. He understood everything. He was crippled, helpless, a prisoner. He was at her mercy. She moved slowly, deliberately. She placed a dipper of fresh water and a piece of cornbread on the straw, just out of his immediate reach. Then she backed away, watching him. It was a test, a silent negotiation in a language they both understood. For a long, tense moment, he just watched her, his eyes unblinking. Then, with a pained grunt that tore from deep in his chest, he dragged himself forward. His face contorted in agony as his shattered legs shifted. He snatched the dipper and drank deeply, his eyes never leaving hers. He ignored the bread. This became their new reality, a silent, cautious dance. Sarah would bring him food and water. She would tend to his leg. He would watch her, his silence a palpable force in the barn. She never asked his name. He never offered it. In her mind, she started calling him Nate, a simple, solid name, less threatening than Apache warrior. A week later, her fragile peace was shattered. A buggy rolled up to her cabin. It was Doc Abernathy. He was a kind, weary man in his 60s who had been a friend of Angus. "Just checking in, Sarah," he said, his eyes full of concern. "Mrs. Higgins mentioned you haven't been in for supplies." Getting worried. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "I'm fine, doctor, just busy." "You look worn to a frazzle," he observed, his keen eyes missing nothing. He glanced toward the barn. "Everything all right with the stock?" "They're fine," she said a little too quickly. The lie felt like sandpaper on her tongue. She trusted the doctor, but she was terrified. His gaze followed hers to the barn, and a look of dawning comprehension mixed with alarm crossed his face. He lowered his voice. "Sarah, what's going on?" The dam broke. The exhaustion, the fear, the crushing loneliness. It all came pouring out. She didn't say a word. She just led him to the barn. Nate was sitting with his back against the stall wall. When he saw the doctor, his entire body went rigid. His hand instinctively went to a hip that no longer held a knife. Doc Abernathy stopped, holding his hands up just as Sarah had. He looked from Nate to Sarah, then at the crudely splinted leg. He let out a long, slow whistle. "Good Lord, child, what have you gotten yourself into?" He examined the leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. Nate endured it with a stoic silence, but Sarah could see the cords in his neck standing out in pain. "The leg is a mess," Abernathy said quietly to her as he straightened up. "The bone is knitting all wrong. He'll live, thanks to you, but he'll never walk right again. He'll have a permanent, severe limp." He looked at Nate with a flicker of pity. "For a man like him, that's a fate worse than death." Before he left, the doctor gave her laudanum for the pain and proper medical dressings. "I never saw this, you understand," he told her, his face grim. "But you're playing with fire, Sarah. If Bart Corian or his man Kane get wind of this, they won't be as understanding as I am." His visit was a double-edged sword, relief, and a sharpened sense of the danger she was in. She didn't have to wait long. The very next day, that danger rode right up to her door. It was Bart Corian himself. He was a big man who overflowed his expensive saddle, his face flushed and his smile slick with oil. "Sarah, my dear," he boomed, dismounting with a grunt. "I was just riding the fence line and thought I'd see how you were faring." "I'm managing, Mr. Corian," she said. Her posture was stiff as a board, her hand gripping the porch rail to stop it from shaking. "Are you, though?" he said, his eyes sweeping over the dusty yard, the sagging barn roof. "This is a lot of land for a woman alone. My offer still stands. A fair price, enough to set you up comfortably back east, away from all this hardship. The ranch is not for sale." Corian's smile tightened at the edges. "Pride is a fine thing, Sarah, but it doesn't fill a belly or pay a banknote. Those notes are coming due. I'd hate to see the bank have to foreclose." It was a threat wrapped in concern, delivered with a smile that made her skin crawl. As he spoke, Sarah saw it, a flicker of movement from the dark crack of the barn door. Nate was watching. His dark eyes were fixed on Corian, and for the first time, she saw an expression other than pain or suspicion on his face. It was a cold, pure, calculating hatred. In that single shared glare, she knew. Corian wasn't just her enemy, he was Nate's too. An alliance had just been sealed. In the weeks that followed, Dust Devil Creek began to change. The unspoken alliance between the widow and the warrior started to take root in the parched soil. Nate, whose real name was Nantan, began to heal. Doc Abernathy was right. The leg was a mangled, rigid knot. The fluid grace of the hunter was gone, replaced by a painful, lurching gait. He was a broken warrior, but what he'd lost in mobility, he seemed to gain in perception. His eyes missed nothing. He moved out of the barn and into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, a space Angus had used for tack. From its doorway, he could watch the entire ranch, and he watched everything. His silence was no longer just watchful, It was instructive. One morning, Sarah was struggling with a leaking water bucket at the well, her shoulders aching. Nate limped over. Without a word, he took the bucket. He pointed to the frayed rope, then to the worn pulley. He made a small circular motion with his finger and mimicked a squeaking sound. Sarah understood. The next time she rode to Prescott, she used her precious egg money to buy a new rope and a small can of axle grease. The simple fix made the daily chore immeasurably easier. Another day, he watched her spend an hour searching in frustration for two cows that had wandered off. He gestured for her to follow. Limping painfully, he led her not where she'd been looking, but in the opposite direction, toward a small shaded arroyo she hadn't even known existed. And there they were, the missing cows. He pointed to the ground, showing her the signs she had missed. A bent blade of grass, a dislodged pebble, the faint scuff of a hoof in the hard-packed dirt. He was teaching her to read the land. He taught her without words. He showed her how to reinforce a fence post with rocks to make it stronger. He pointed out which plants the cattle preferred and which were poisonous. He dug up a root, mashed it into a paste, and applied it to a nasty cut on her hand. It healed cleanly in 2 days. He was a master of this harsh world. Sarah in turn gave him food, shelter, and a safe harbor from the world that wanted him dead. It was a partnership of pure survival, and the ranch began to reflect it. The fences were tighter, the well worked smoothly. The cattle, guided to better grazing, started to look healthier. A fragile sprout of hope began to grow in the barren soil of Sarah's heart. But hope in this country attracts vultures. The whispers had already started in Prescott. Mrs. Higgins, the portly owner of the general store, had noted Sarah's purchase of an extra measure of flour and an unusual amount of bandages. Strange, she'd comment to anyone who would listen. A woman alone buying supplies for two, and her looking haunted as a ghost. The whispers reached Bart Corian. He didn't care about rumors of a hidden man. He cared about the improvements he could see from his own land. The widow McGregor was supposed to be failing. She was supposed to be crawling to him, begging to sell. Instead, she was holding on. Her defiance was an insult. The first attack was subtle. A section of her northern fence was cut one night. Not broken, but cleanly snipped with wire cutters. It took Sarah a full day to find the breach and round up the dozen cattle that had wandered onto Seabar land. When she approached Corian's foreman, Silas Kane, to get them back, he just sneered. Kane was a man carved from malice, tall and thin as a rail, with a cruel twist to his lips. "These cattle are on Seabar property, ma'am," he drawled, leaning against a post. "Finders keepers, I reckon, unless you can prove they're yours." Her cattle were unbranded. Angus had always meant to do it, but there was never enough money for a proper branding iron. It was a fatal oversight. Fuming with helpless rage, she had to ride away, leaving her animals behind. When she told Nate what happened, gesturing and drawing in the dirt to explain the theft, his face hardened into a mask of granite. That evening, he disappeared. Sarah's heart sank. Had he abandoned her? Was he just another man who was going to leave her to face this alone? She spent the night staring into the darkness, the silence of the ranch once again her enemy. But just before dawn, he returned. His limp was more pronounced, his face etched with exhaustion. He said nothing. 2 days later, 5 of Corian's prize bulls mysteriously wandered into a thicket of chala cactus on the edge of Seabar territory. They emerged with hides full of painful spines that would take weeks to properly heal and render them useless for the season. Nate had struck back. The escalation was swift. A week later, Sarah found her small vegetable garden trampled. The work of a single horse, ridden back and forth through the rows, destroying weeks of hard labor. Then the well pump was sabotaged, a critical bolt removed and tossed away, forcing her to haul water by hand from the creek bed 200 yards away. Each act of petty cruelty was a needle, designed to slowly bleed her spirit dry. The pressure from the town mounted alongside it. Old acquaintances now crossed the street to avoid her. The banker, a man named Peterson, who was squarely in Corian's pocket, sent her a curt letter. Her loan payment was due in 30 days. There would be no extension. The final blow came when Sheriff Brody paid her a visit. He was a decent man, but a cautious one, and he knew where the real power in the county lay. "Sarah," he began, removing his hat and wiping his sweaty brow, "folks are talking. They say you're not alone out here. They say you're harboring. Well, they're saying all sorts of things. I'm a widow trying to run her ranch, Sheriff. That's all, she replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. There have been incidents, Brody pressed on. Cut fences, lamed bulls over at the C-Bar. Corian's not a man who takes kindly to such things. He's saying an Apache renegade is using your land as a base. He's demanding I form a posse to search your property. Sarah's blood ran cold. On what grounds? You have no proof. Proof is what a man like Bart Corian says it is, Brody admitted grimly. I've held him off for now, told him I'd investigate personally. But my hands are tied, Sarah. If I have to come out here with a warrant, I will. Be careful. His warning hung in the air long after he'd ridden away. The sanctuary she had built was gone. The world, with all its prejudice and greed, was closing in. That night, a storm rolled in, a violent tempest of lightning and thunder that mirrored the chaos in her soul. Huddled in the cabin, listening to the wind howl like a dying animal, Sarah looked over at the lean-to. In a brilliant flash of lightning, she saw him. Nate was standing in the doorway, his silhouette stark and unmoving, staring out into the dark, rain-swept territory. He wasn't just watching her ranch anymore. He was watching for an enemy he knew was coming. The whispers had become threats, and they both knew the threats would soon become violence. They were trapped, an island in a sea of hatred, and the tide was coming in. As the calendar turned, the Arizona heat changed. The baking heat of summer gave way to a dry, brittle heat that sucked the last traces of moisture from the land. The rains from the storm were a distant memory. A drought, silent and relentless, settled over the valley. The seasonal creek on Sarah's land, which should have held a trickle of water into the fall, was now just a snake of cracked mud and sun-bleached stones. The water level in her well dropped. Every pull of the handle was a gamble, bringing up less and less water with a sickening, gritty gasp. Her cattle grew gaunt, their ribs showing like washboards. The grass turned from gold to a lifeless, ashen gray. Her ranch was dying of thirst. Meanwhile, Corian's C-Bar remained stubbornly green. From the high ridge on her property, she could see a swath of verdant pasture. His cattle were fat and content, gathering at a large, brimming water trough. It made no sense. It was a cruel joke played by a merciless god. Nate knew better. He knew the land followed rules older than any man, older than any fence line. Water did not simply stop because a line was drawn in the dirt. For days, he observed, he would climb the ridge at dawn, his powerful eyes scanning the landscape. He saw that the deer and coyotes which once drank from the creek on Sarah's land now skirted her property entirely, heading further north deep into C-Bar territory. The land was telling him a story, and it was a story of theft. One morning he approached Sarah as she stared hopelessly at the nearly dry well. He pointed north, up the dry creek bed toward Corian's land. Then he made a gesture with his hands, pressing them together as if building a wall. He repeated the motion, his expression grim. Sarah frowned, not understanding. "What is it, Nate?" He grunted in frustration, the inability to speak a galling prison. He picked up a stick and drew a long, winding line in the dust. The creek. He drew a small square on the line on her side, her ranch. Then further up the line, deep inside the territory he had marked as Corian's, he drew a thick, heavy bar across the creek. He stabbed the stick into the dust behind the bar. The meaning hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. A dam. "You think he dammed the creek?" she whispered, horrified. Nate nodded, his eyes like flint. It was more than a suspicion. It was a certainty. Corian hadn't just been lucky. He had actively stolen their water, choking the life from her land to feed his own. The vandalism, the stolen cattle, all of it was a smokescreen for this single, devastating act of sabotage. Rage, pure and cold, burned away her fear. Her enemy had a face, but proving it was another matter entirely. The dam would be deep inside Corian's property, patrolled by men like Silas Kane, who would shoot first and ask questions never. A lone woman accusing the most powerful man in the county would be laughed out of the sheriff's office. They needed proof, concrete, undeniable proof. That night, under a sliver of a new moon, Nate prepared to leave. Sarah watched as he checked the bindings on his moccasins and filled a small leather pouch with jerky. He moved with a pained but resolute purpose. "You can't," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. His muscles were like steel. "Your leg. They'll kill you if they find you." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond grim determination. It was a shared understanding. He had to go. This wasn't just about her ranch anymore. In his world, water was sacred, a gift to be shared. Corian's greed was an offense against the natural order. His limp was a constant, burning reminder of his vulnerability, but the spirit of the warrior remained unbroken. He placed his hand briefly over hers. The touch was rough, calloused, but it conveyed a universe of meaning. "I must do this, for both of us." He slipped out of the lean-to and melted into the darkness. Sarah stood by the cabin door for an hour, staring into the black void where he had disappeared. The silence of the ranch was once again her only companion. But this time, it was not the silence of despair. It was the taut, humming silence of anticipation, the silence before a battle. She had entrusted her entire future to a crippled Apache warrior on a suicide mission into the heart of enemy territory. And all she could do was wait. 2 days felt like 2 years. Sarah went through the motions of her chores in a daze, her eyes constantly scanning the northern ridge, her ears straining for any sound. Every shadow was a threat, every distant rider a harbinger of doom. She imagined a dozen terrible scenarios: Nate captured, tortured by Cain, his body left for the coyotes, a posse riding down on her with Corian at its head. The fragile hope she had nurtured felt like a candle flame in a hurricane. On the evening of the second day, he returned. He didn't come from the north, but from the east, using the broken terrain for cover. He materialized from the twilight like a ghost, haggard and caked in dust. His limp was so pronounced he was using a branch as a crutch. He was exhausted to the bone, but his eyes burned with a triumphant fire. He collapsed by the water barrel, and Sarah rushed to him. As he drank, he pulled a small, damp object from his pouch and handed it to her. It was a piece of wood, freshly cut, with bright orange paint on it. Sarah recognized it instantly. It was from a crate of mining equipment she'd seen delivered to the C-Bar months back, stamped with the name of a Denver supplier. Nate began to sketch in the dirt again, his hands moving with urgent precision. He drew the dam, not as a simple line, but in detail, an earthen structure, reinforced with timber and, crucially, new-looking wooden planks. Planks that would match the piece of crate he'd brought back. He drew its location, 10 miles up the creek, hidden in a narrow canyon. He'd not only found it, he'd brought back physical proof that it was a recent construction, made with materials directly traceable to Corian. The next morning, armed with this evidence, Sarah rode for Prescott. She bypassed the sheriff's office. Instead, she went to the Territorial Land Office, a dusty building run by a harried clerk. Pleading a fictitious boundary dispute, she asked to see the original survey maps for the valley, including the water rights charters. She spent hours poring over the brittle maps, and then she found it. In faded ink, a clause in the original charter for her land, filed 20 years prior, and shall retain riparian rights to the natural and uninterrupted flow of Dust Devil Creek. Angus had probably never even known it existed. It was a legal term, a relic from another time. But it was the law. Corian wasn't just being immoral, he was breaking a foundational law of the territory. Now she went to Sheriff Brody's office. She laid the piece of wood, a hand-drawn copy of Nate's map, and a tracing of the water rights charter on his desk. "Bartholomew Corian is stealing my water, Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He built an illegal dam, and it is a direct violation of my property's legal charter." Brody stared at the evidence, his expression troubled. He picked up the piece of painted wood. "Sarah, this is compelling, but it's not enough. This piece of wood could have come from anywhere. Your map is hand-drawn. To get a warrant to search 10 miles inside Corian's land, I need more. I need a sworn witness who saw the dam." "And who would that be?" Sarah challenged, her heart sinking. "The man who risked his life to find it is an Apache. Will his words stand up in a white man's court against Bart Corian's?" They both knew the answer. Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm sorry, Sarah. My hands are tied. Without a credible witness, it's your word against his, and his word owns half this county. She left the office feeling defeated, but not broken. The law was a tool for the powerful. It wouldn't save her. If they were to survive, they would have to do it themselves. They couldn't outfight Corian, and they couldn't outmaneuver him legally. They had to outthink him. Returning to the ranch, she explained the situation to Nate. He listened patiently, his gaze distant. When she was finished, he didn't look defeated. He looked thoughtful. He limped to the dying vegetable garden, picked up a handful of the dry, lifeless soil, and let it run through his fingers. Then he walked to the well, peering down into its dark, nearly empty shaft. He spent the rest of the day walking the property. He moved slowly, painfully, his eyes on the ground, reading the contour of the land itself. Sarah watched, mystified, as he paced back and forth across a seemingly barren patch of ground about 50 yards from the cabin. Finally, he stopped. He drove the heel of his good leg into the earth, then scraped a circle in the dirt about 6 feet wide. He looked at Sarah, pointed at the circle, then mimicked the motion of digging. "Here," she asked, incredulous. "Nate, the well is over there. Why would there be water here?" He just tapped the spot again, his expression insistent. He was seeing something she couldn't, sensing a truth hidden beneath the cracked surface. She had a choice: trust conventional wisdom, which said her ranch was doomed, or trust the crippled warrior who had read the land's secrets before. Looking into his unwavering eyes, she made her decision. She grabbed a shovel and a pickaxe from the barn. The work was brutal. The ground was baked as hard as brick. For 2 days they toiled under the merciless sun, a team united by a single, desperate hope. Sarah would break the earth with the pickaxe, her shoulders screaming with the effort, and then shovel out the loosened dirt. Nate, unable to swing the heavy tool with his bad leg, would sit at the edge of the growing hole, sharpening the tools on a whetstone or clearing debris with a smaller spade. They worked in a shared, sweat-soaked silence. Other ranchers might have hired a crew, maybe used dynamite. They had nothing but their own grit and Nate's mysterious conviction. By the end of the second day, they had a hole 10 feet deep, and all they had to show for it was a pile of dry dirt and bleeding blisters. Sarah's faith began to crumble. "It's no you," she gasped, leaning on her shovel, her body trembling with exhaustion. "There's nothing here." Nate gestured for the shovel. He limped down into the hole, his face a mask of concentration. He began to dig carefully at the center, not with brute force, but with a focused precision. He scraped away a layer of clay, then another, and then he stopped. He looked up at her, a single triumphant glint in his eye. Sarah scrambled to the edge and looked down. At the bottom of the hole, a small dark patch had appeared, a patch of mud. As she watched, breathless, a tiny pool of water, clear and clean, began to seep up from the earth, shimmering in the fading light. It wasn't a gushing spring, but it was life. It was a defiant miracle. They hadn't found Corian's stolen river. They had found their own. They had been trying to fight him on his terms, with his laws and his rules. Nate had shown her another way. Strength wasn't just about power and money and legal documents. It was about knowledge, about resilience, about listening to the land instead of trying to conquer it. That small pool of water at the bottom of a dusty hole was a greater victory than any court case. It was the taste of survival. But that taste was about to turn to ash in her mouth. The discovery of the new well was a secret lifeline, a defiant pulse of water that Bartholomew Corian knew nothing about. For a few weeks, a quiet miracle unfolded. While the rest of the valley withered, a small patch of green began to reemerge at Dust Devil Creek. This silent survival, this stubborn refusal to fail, was an intolerable insult to Corian. He had cut off her water, turned the town against her, and still she endured. With the due date for her banknote just days away, his patience finally snapped. He decided to abandon all pretense and obliterate her with a single devastating act of force, a cattle stampede. Under the cover of darkness, his men would drive 1,000 head of Seabar longhorns directly through her property. The unstoppable wave of panicked beef would demolish her fences, flatten her cabin, and, most critically, collapse her new well. burying her hopes under tons of churned earth. In the morning, it would all be chalked up as a tragic, unavoidable accident. A poor widow, just another victim of the harshness of the West. Corian, however, saw only a widow. He failed to account for the warrior at her side. Nate felt the change in the air. He observed the C-Bar riders who now patrolled the fence line with a predatory focus, their eyes mapping the terrain of Sarah's small ranch. He recognized the signs of a gathering storm and began his own silent preparations. He worked with a grim purpose that filled Sarah with a quiet dread. He dug a small, deep alcove into the wall of the arroyo near the well, a space just large enough to offer shelter. In a dry wash on the western edge of the property, he amassed a massive pile of dry tumbleweeds, creating a tinderbox awaiting a spark. He was preparing for a war he knew was coming. It came on a moonless, suffocatingly still night. The first sign wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A low, persistent vibration in the soles of their feet, a tremor in the very bones of the earth. Nate was instantly alert, his head cocked. A moment later, a distant rumble began, like faraway thunder. The sound swelled, growing, resolving itself into the terrifying roar of 1,000 thundering hooves. "They're here," Sarah whispered, her blood running cold. "Come," Nate commanded, his voice a low growl. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel, pulling her not towards the flimsy security of the cabin, but out into the open, towards the arroyo. They scrambled into the dry wash just as the first wave of cattle crashed through the fence line. The sound of splintering wood was lost in the deafening chaos. Dust exploded into the air, thick and choking, the smell of animal panic filling their lungs. Nate shoved her into the hidden alcove he had carved from the earth and pressed himself in beside her. Their world dissolved into a nightmare of sound and fury. Horned beasts, their eyes white with terror, galloped past their hiding spot, their hooves churning the ground just inches away. The earth shook violently, and Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, certain they would be buried alive. In the swirling dust, she caught glimpses of the riders on the herd's flank. Corian's men firing pistols into the air, directing the flow of destruction. She saw the lean figure of Silas Kane, a demonic grin illuminated on his face by a muzzle flash. This was no accident. It was an execution. But as the heart of the herd thundered towards the well, Nate's plan ignited. A slow-burning, oil-soaked rope he had lit just moments before reached the pile of tumbleweeds. The dry brush erupted in a sudden, brilliant wall of fire. The led cattle, confronted with the terrifying sight, shrieked and shied away violently. The herd, a single organism of pure instinct, veered sharply. Its path was diverted. The main force of the stampede was turned, crashing harmlessly through an empty pasture before dispersing into the dark. The cabin and the well were saved. Enraged that his primary targets had been spared, Silas Kane spotted them climbing out of the arroyo. "There!" he bellowed, reining his horse around. "Finish them!" He and another rider charged. Nate shoved Sarah behind him, grabbing a sturdy fallen branch to use as a staff. As the first rider galloped into the wash, Nate moved with a pained but startling agility. He swung the staff not at the rider, but at the horse's front legs. The animal screamed and crumpled, throwing its rider heavily to the ground. Kane, closing in, drew his pistol, his face a mask of murderous fury. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. Before he could fire, Sarah raised the Colt she now carried everywhere. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady. She fired. The shot went wide of Kane, but it struck his horse in the shoulder. The animal reared in pain, unseating Kane and sending him tumbling into the dust. He scrambled to his feet, his pistol lost in the dark, and lunged at Nate. It was a raw, brutal fight. Kane had size and strength. Nate had a lifetime of desperate combat. He sidestepped Kane's clumsy charge, using his opponent's momentum to send him sprawling. They wrestled in the dirt, a grunting, violent tangle of limbs. Kane's brute force was met by Nate's calculated, painful strikes. Seeing her chance, Sarah darted forward and snatched Kane's fallen pistol from the ground. She ran to the struggling men and pressed the cold steel barrel firmly against Kane's temple. "It's over, Kane," she commanded, her voice ragged but absolute. The foreman froze, the fight draining out of him, replaced by the cold finality of defeat. He had been beaten by the very people he had come to destroy. As if on cue, a lantern's glow appeared on the ridge. Sheriff Brody, drawn from Prescott by the unbelievable noise of the stampede, reined in his horse, his face grim. He took in the scene below, the chaos of the scattered herd, a groaning C-bar rider on the ground, and Sarah McGregor, the broken widow, holding a gun on a bloodied and beaten Silas Kane, while the silent Apache warrior stood resolute at her side. There were no more rumors, no more whispers. Here in the dust and the dark was the undeniable truth. The reckoning had finally come. The arrival of Sheriff Brody changed everything. With Silas Kane captured red-handed, his face bloody and his spirit broken, the carefully constructed facade of Bart Corian began to crumble. Under the sheriff's interrogation, facing the very real threat of a noose for attempted murder, Kane's loyalty to his boss evaporated. He confessed to everything. The cut fences, the stolen cattle, the sabotage, the illegal dam, and the orchestrated stampede. Armed with a sworn confession, Sheriff Brody was no longer a cautious politician. He was an instrument of justice. He deputized two men and rode out to the C-bar at dawn. He arrested Bartholomew Corian in his lavish, oversized ranch house. Corian, blustering and threatening, found that his money and influence meant nothing in the face of a signed confession and a determined sheriff. The news spread through Prescott like wildfire. The trial was the biggest event the county had ever seen. People who had shunned Sarah and whispered behind her back now packed the courtroom, their allegiances shifting with the prevailing winds of justice. Sarah took the stand, her voice clear and steady. She recounted the months of intimidation and hardship. She spoke of the stolen water and the terror of the stampede. She did not mention Nate by name, referring to him only as a man to whom I gave shelter, who helped me survive. She was protecting him, even now. Corian was found guilty on all counts. His empire, built on greed and fear, collapsed. The court ordered the immediate destruction of the illegal dam and levied a massive fine against the C-bar. A portion of that fine was awarded to Sarah McGregor as restitution. The C-bar ranch was broken up and sold off. Its reign of terror was over. In the aftermath, a profound change settled over the valley. As water from the freed creek began to flow back into the dry creek bed at Dust Devil Creek, it was as if life itself was returning. The trickle became a steady stream, nourishing the cottonwoods and turning the parched earth dark and fertile once more. The land began to heal. Sarah McGregor was no longer the poor broken widow. She was a figure of respect, even awe. She had faced down the most powerful man in the territory and won. Doors opened to her. The bank offered her a generous new loan. Neighbors who had once shunned her rode over to offer help and congratulations. She used the restitution money wisely. She bought a proper branding iron, stamping her cattle with a new brand, two intersecting wavy lines representing the two creeks, the one stolen and returned, and the one discovered beneath the earth. She hired two ranch hands and bought a small herd of quality breeding stock. The ranch began to not just survive, but to thrive. Through it all, Nate remained. He stayed in the lean-to, a quiet, constant presence. The town's perception of him shifted too. The fear was replaced by a grudging respect, fueled by the whispered stories of his role in that final, violent night. They no longer saw a hostile renegade. They saw the mysterious protector of the McGregor Ranch. His relationship with Sarah deepened, evolving beyond their silent partnership. They still spoke little, but they no longer needed to. They communicated through shared glances in the easy rhythms of work. He would watch her from the porch as she managed her growing enterprise, a flicker of pride in his dark eyes. She would leave a freshly baked pie to cool on the lean-to's railing, a simple offering of gratitude and affection. One evening as the sun set, painting the mesas in hues of orange and purple, Sarah found him sitting on the ridge overlooking the ranch. The two creeks were nourishing a swath of green that was growing larger every day. The sound of healthy cattle and the distant laughter of her new ranch hands drifted up on the evening breeze. She sat down beside him on the warm rock. For a long time, they watched the twilight settle over the land they had saved together. "I'm changing the name of the ranch," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I can't call it Dust Devil Creek anymore." He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm going to call it Two Creeks Ranch," she continued, "for the water we have, the water we fought for." She finally turned to look at him, her heart full. "It's your home too, Nate. If you want it." He turned his head slowly, his weathered face softened by the dying light. He looked at her, then at the thriving ranch below, then back to her. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. He gave a single, slow nod. It was enough. It was everything. They were an unlikely pair, a Scottish widow and a crippled Apache warrior. Two broken people from warring worlds who had found common ground in the dust. They had faced down greed, prejudice, and violence, and through their shared resilience, they had taken a barren patch of land and a legacy of despair, and together they had forged not just the strongest ranch in the territory, but a testament to the enduring power of a shared home. The story of Sarah McGregor and the warrior she called Nate is a testament to the fact that strength isn't always measured in land or cattle or coin. Sometimes it's measured in the quiet courage to help a stranger, in the resilience to stand against impossible odds, and in the wisdom to build an alliance where others only see a divide. Theirs is a story carved into the very heart of the American West, a tale of how two outcasts united by hardship could not only survive, but build a legacy of hope that would nourish the land for generations to come. If this story of grit, determination, and the unlikely bonds that define us resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share this tale with someone who appreciates a true Western drama. And most importantly, subscribe for more stories of the forgotten heroes and unsung legends of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.